In 216 BC, on a flat plain in southern Italy called Cannae, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca faced a Roman army nearly double the size of his own. By the end of the day, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Roman soldiers were dead, killed in a matter of hours. It remains one of the highest single-day death tolls in the history of human warfare. Hannibal didn't win because his soldiers were stronger. He didn't win because he had better weapons. He won because he understood something that most commanders of his era didn't, that the arrangement of men on a battlefield, the geometry of conflict, could be used as a weapon just as lethal as any sword or spear. The double envelopment he used at Cannae is still studied in military academies around the world today, 2,200 years later. It influenced Napoleon. It influenced the German generals who planned the invasion of France in 1940. The tactics change. The principles underneath them almost never do. This is the entire history of tactical warfare. How human beings learned to fight smarter. How each new weapon or technology forced a completely new way of thinking about battle, and why the most important battlefield innovations were almost never about strength at all. The earliest organized warfare wasn't particularly tactical. The first armies in Mesopotamia and Egypt fought in loose formations, overwhelming enemies through sheer numbers and individual combat. But even in these early conflicts, the first great tactical insight was beginning to emerge, that organized groups of men fighting together in coordinated formations could defeat much larger groups of individuals fighting alone. The phalanx, developed first by the Sumerians and refined by the Greeks into one of the most effective infantry formations in ancient history, was the physical expression of this insight. A Greek phalanx consisted of heavily armored infantry called hoplites, standing in tight ranks, overlapping their large circular shields to form a continuous wall, with spears extended forward in multiple rows. The result was a formation that was almost impossible to break from the front. No individual warrior, however skilled, could fight his way through a wall of overlapping shields and spear points. The phalanx dominated ancient warfare for centuries, and its weakness was also its greatest lesson. It was nearly unstoppable from the front, but almost completely helpless on its flanks. Every major tactical innovation in ancient warfare was essentially an attempt to either protect your own flanks or attack your enemies. This insight, that formations have strengths and weaknesses, and that the goal of tactics is to exploit the enemy's weakness while protecting your own, is the foundational logic that underlies almost everything that comes after. Alexander the Great refined this further into something genuinely revolutionary. His armies combined the Macedonian phalanx, an improved version with longer spears called sarissas that extended so far they created an almost impenetrable barrier with highly mobile heavy cavalry on the flanks. The phalanx fixed the enemy in place. The cavalry attacked the weakened flanks and rear. It was a combined arms approach, using different types of forces together to create effects that neither could achieve alone. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, Alexander faced a Persian army vastly larger than his own. Rather than trying to match the Persians across the whole line, he deliberately created a gap in his own formation, used it to draw the Persian king's elite units toward it, and then drove his cavalry through the resulting opening directly toward the Persian command center. The battle ended when the Persian king fled, and his army collapsed without leadership. The tactical lesson was profound. You don't need to destroy an entire army. You need to destroy its ability to function as an army, attack the command, break the cohesion, create panic. An army that stops believing it can win has already lost. Rome took these lessons and systematized them differently. Where the phalanx was powerful but rigid, the Roman legion was built around flexibility. Roman legionaries fought in smaller, more maneuverable units called maniples and later cohorts, which could respond to uneven terrain, rotate tired units out of the front line, and adapt to an enemy's movements in ways that a rigid phalanx simply could not. It was Roman flexibility that eventually defeated the phalanx in a series of conflicts against Greek successor states in the 2nd century BC. The Roman legion could split, wheel, and reform on broken ground, where a phalanx became disorganized and vulnerable. But as Cannae demonstrated, even Roman flexibility had its limits. When Hannibal deliberately weakened his own center to absorb the Roman advance, and then closed his stronger flanking forces around the Roman sides and rear, the Romans found themselves in a pocket with no room to maneuver, their famous flexibility rendered useless by the simple geometry of encirclement. Soldiers died not from wounds, but from suffocation and crushing as the mass of trapped men compressed inward with nowhere to go. The lesson of Cannae, learned and relearned across 2 millennia, is that mass and position can kill more efficiently than individual combat, control the shape of the battle, and the outcome often follows. After Rome's decline, medieval warfare reorganized itself around 2 dominant elements, the heavily armored mounted knight and the fortified castle. For several centuries, heavy cavalry was the decisive arm of battle. A charge of armored knights at full speed was almost impossible to stop with infantry alone, and much of medieval tactical thinking revolved around either deploying cavalry effectively or finding ways to counter it. The castle transformed warfare equally profoundly. Rather than winning battles in the open field, medieval commanders increasingly sought to control territory through fortified strongpoints that were enormously expensive and time-consuming to besiege. Siege warfare became as important as open battle, and the skills of the military engineer, designing both fortifications and the machines to breach them, became as valuable as the skills of the battlefield commander. The dominance of heavy cavalry and castle warfare was ended by 2 developments that came within a century of each other. The first was the English longbow. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen decimated charge after charge of French mounted knights with a rate of fire so high and an effective range so long that the knights were being killed before they could close to combat range. Crécy demonstrated something that armies would have to relearn repeatedly over the following centuries, that missile weapons, when used in sufficient concentration, could neutralize the shock power of heavy close combat forces. The second and far more consequential development was gunpowder. Arriving in Europe from China via the Islamic world during the 13th and 14th centuries, gunpowder didn't immediately transform warfare. Early cannons were slow, unreliable, and difficult to move. But by the 15th century, they had become powerful enough to do something that changed the entire logic of medieval fortification. They could bring down castle walls. The fortifications that had defined European warfare for centuries were suddenly obsolete. The response was a new type of fortification, the trace italienne, a low-angled system of earthworks and bastions designed to absorb cannon fire and provide defensive cannon positions in return. It was expensive, technically demanding, and took decades to spread. But it fundamentally changed the relationship between attack and defense in warfare for the next 2 centuries. As firearms developed through the 16th and 17th centuries, the infantry formations that had ruled ancient and medieval battlefields had to reinvent themselves completely. Early muskets were slow to reload, relatively inaccurate, and gave no protection in close combat. Armies solved this by combining musketeers with pike infantry, the musketeers providing firepower while the pikemen protected them from cavalry during reloading. The tactical problem became one of timing and coordination. How do you deliver fire at the right moment, maintain formation under fire, and transition to different combat phases without losing cohesion? Maurice of Nassau in the late 16th century and Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden in the early 17th began solving this through drill and discipline, training soldiers to perform complex loading and firing sequences as automatic muscle memory so they could do it reliably under the stress of battle. Gustavus Adolphus further refined this into coordinated combined arms operations at a scale previously unseen, integrating disciplined musketeer infantry, mobile artillery that could be repositioned during battle, and aggressive cavalry into a single tactical system. It was the most sophisticated approach to battlefield coordination seen since Alexander. By the 18th century, the dominance of linear tactics, long lines of musket-armed infantry delivering coordinated volley fire at close range, had created a style of warfare that looked almost formalized. Armies maneuvered in precise formations, and battles were decided by which side could deliver more concentrated fire while maintaining its own formation under fire. The officer's job was fundamentally about maintaining order and cohesion under terrifying conditions, since a formation that broke and fled was almost always destroyed by pursuing cavalry. Napoleon shattered this approach entirely. Rather than deploying his army in a single long line, Napoleon organized his forces into independent corps, each containing infantry, cavalry, and artillery, capable of fighting independently or combining rapidly when needed. This allowed him to move faster than enemies expected, concentrate force at unexpected points, and fight battles on multiple axes simultaneously. At Austerlitz in 1805, he deliberately weakened his right flank to draw the Austro-Russian center toward it, then shattered their weakened center with a concentrated attack, splitting their army in two and defeating each half separately. Napoleon didn't invent most of the elements he used. What he mastered was their combination and the speed at which he employed them. He understood, more clearly than almost any commander before him, that time was itself a weapon. An army that moved and decided faster than its opponent could act inside the opponent's decision cycle, creating confusion and forcing reactions rather than actions. The 19th century brought industrialization to warfare, and with it, changes more rapid and profound than any previous period. Rifled firearms dramatically extended the effective range of infantry weapons. The railway allowed armies to be moved and supplied at speeds previously impossible. The telegraph allowed commanders to coordinate forces across distances that would previously have required days of messenger riding. The result, painfully and catastrophically demonstrated during the American Civil War, and then again in World War I, was that the firepower available to defenders had outrun the tactical methods of attackers. Infantry advancing in formation across open ground against entrenched defenders armed with rifles and machine guns were slaughtered. The trenches of the Western Front from 1914 to 1918 were the logical consequence of a tactical system that had not yet found an answer to modern defensive firepower. The answers came eventually in the form of combined arms integration at a new level of sophistication. Tanks to cross ground under fire and suppress defensive positions, aircraft to attack supply lines and provide observation, artillery to suppress defenders during the moment of assault, and infantry to hold ground once taken. These elements existed separately in World War I. In World War II, Germany integrated them into the Blitzkrieg approach, using fast-moving armored formations with close air support to penetrate enemy lines, drive deep into the rear, and destroy the enemy's ability to command and supply its forces before it could react. The principle was the same one Alexander had used at Gaugamela. Don't try to destroy the entire enemy force. Destroy its ability to function as a force. Attack the command, the logistics, the cohesion. An army that cannot communicate, resupply, or receive orders has already been defeated, regardless of how many soldiers it still has in the field. The second half of the 20th century added nuclear weapons, which paradoxically made large-scale conventional warfare between major powers almost impossible, and guerrilla and asymmetric tactics, which became the dominant form of actual armed conflict as smaller forces developed methods of negating the conventional military advantages of larger ones. Ambush, dispersal, blending with civilian populations, attacking supply lines rather than armies. These were not new ideas. They were ancient principles applied to modern conditions. Today, warfare is evolving again into domains that ancient commanders never imagined. Cyber operations that can disable infrastructure without firing a shot. Drone warfare that removes human pilots from the battlefield entirely. Artificial intelligence that processes battlefield information faster than any human commander can. The weapons change. The fundamental questions, How do you find, fix, and defeat an enemy while protecting your own forces and maintaining cohesion under stress have not changed since the first organized armies formed their first formations on the plains of ancient Mesopotamia? Hannibal's encirclement at Cannae, Alexander's strike at the command center, Napoleon's speed inside the enemy's decision cycle. The principles behind each of these victories are still being studied, still being applied, still shaping how modern militaries think about the problem of organized violence. The history of tactical warfare is, in the end, a history of human problem solving under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Every new weapon created a new problem. Every new problem eventually produced a new solution. And every solution, sooner or later, became the problem that the next generation had to solve.